Cellular respiration is one of the topics that follows easily from chapter 5. And so these three chapters form a natural series dealing with respiration energy. And the first thing I want to do is give you an introduction to what we're actually talking about. Cellular respiration is something that occurs in both plants and animals, and it is a useful process so that we get all the energy we need. So it's essential to the survival of both plants and animals. As a chemical process, what does it do? It breaks down organic molecules to make the energy available. And when it breaks down organic molecules, what we ultimately mean is we're going to look at bond energy. We're going to extract bond energy. It occurs in mitochondria. Those are the small energy organelles in our cells. This is something that plants also have, but plants also have something else called chloroplasts. About that more later. When cellular respiration proceeds, you're going to end up making certain waste products available, and those waste products are carbon dioxide and water. And the reason why I say make them available is because these are the things that plants will need in photosynthesis. And so that's what happens in chapter 7, what we're going to look at in chapter 7. This is a really important diagram, and I'm going to spend a few minutes explaining it because it's very simple, yet it is very profound, and I really want you to understand it. The first thing that happens here, and this is the basis for all life, is that there is sunlight. So in our case, we're in a solar system where we have a sun that's relatively large from our perspective, and it gives us energy. So the energy from the sun is the critical component. Without the sun, we have nothing. What do I mean by without the sun, we have nothing? The sun is the source for all of the energy we have available on planet Earth. There is a little bit of energy deep down inside the Earth, but that's not ordinarily energy we can tap into. The organisms that live on the surface of this planet are dependent on sunlight. And so this surface ecosystem is going to depend on sunlight. The first step of the energy processes on Earth is photosynthesis. Photosynthesis is a process by which sunlight is converted to chemical energy, and this happens in plants. And so this tree here is something that just signifies all plants. So we have a variety of plants. Obviously, in some places we have a lot of plants. In the high desert we have not so many, but still, all over the place we're going to have plants. What plants do with the sunlight is they produce sugar, here shown as glucose, and oxygen. Now it's obvious that oxygen is a critical part of what we need because without oxygen we can't breathe. So the plants are producing two key ingredients for what we need. We then use these ingredients in cellular respiration, and plants also use these in cellular respiration. And when we use these things in cellular respiration, we produce two things, carbon dioxide and water, and those cycle back into photosynthesis because those are the ingredients that plants need to make more glucose and make more oxygen. And then of course down at the bottom for us, we're going to get some energy out of it. This energy drives our cellular work, and some of the energy based on the second law of thermodynamics is going to be lost to our system, and therefore it can exit the ecosystem. And there's always some heat radiation that actually leaves the Earth. So this is a cycle that is pretty easy to understand. It's an energy cycle of sorts. There are certain parts of this energy cycle that are chemical. There are certain parts that are organismal. And so it's not a hard system to understand. But I want to ask you a question. Based on this cycle, and based on this being a closed cycle, you can understand that there is a certain amount of water and carbon dioxide that's being used by plants, and they produce a certain amount of glucose and oxygen that's used by animals and plants. And this system is, by and large, in balance. It's a closed system, which means nobody's going to open the lid and let out any of the carbon dioxide. It's going to stay here. It's going to stay within our atmosphere. One of the things that you've probably heard of is something called an increase, where's my pen there? An increase in carbon dioxide. So if there is an increase in carbon dioxide, the question is, what does that actually do to this cycle? And let's assume, and this is pretty true, that sunlight is available as an unlimited resource. So there's always more sunlight out there. Let's think this through. If I increase the level of carbon dioxide and everything else basically stays the same, let's also assume, just to make it easier, that we have an unlimited amount of water. And the reason why we can assume that is because 2/3 of the planet is ocean, so presumably there's a lot of water. So if we increase the amount of carbon dioxide, then you would say, well, plants have more food, right? And so if plants have more food, then that means their rate of photosynthesis could increase, and they'd actually end up making more glucose, they'd end up making more oxygen, and that means that the organisms that use glucose and oxygen could also thrive. So this would then be a positive for the entire system. Now, here's a question that we have to ask, and this is, are there any other limiting factors in this that might mean that the carbon dioxide accumulates and is not being used? If you think about this for a minute, maybe you'll say, well, if we are not sure where the carbon dioxide goes, one place to look is how many plants we have. And so the number of plants ultimately determines how much photosynthesis is going to take place. So if you're going to increase the amount of carbon dioxide and you want it used, then you have to make sure that there are enough plants out there. Now, over the last, let's call it 100 years, maybe 200 years, in North America or really anywhere else, do you think that the number of plants has increased or decreased? I hear decreased, and the question is, why do you think that? Okay, buildings. Well, clearly if you're going to put in a parking lot, that's going to take out the plants. But it's also the conversion of forests to grasslands. It's the conversion of forests in North America, for example, to ships. And so over the last 200 years or so, we have consistently been losing plant cover as we as a species, primarily we as a species, have increased our impact on the environment simply by building ships, by building houses, by getting firewood and so on. We've actually decreased the number of plants. So this has gone down. If you have an increase there, and let this be an artificial increase, because when you use fossil fuels, those are not things that are alive today. Those are things that were alive a long time ago. And so fossil in this sense means these are things that are in the ground and they would stay there unless we dig them up. Well, we've been digging them up for, quite some time now. So we do end up with an increase in carbon dioxide from sources within this planet, within this cycle, but from sources that would not normally be able to re-enter the cycle. So this is an artificial increase. It's an artificial increase. Now, there cannot be any argument about the fact that this is an artificial increase. This is something you have to understand clearly. There are a lot of people out there that are producing a lot of window dressing for whether global warming is real or global warming is not, and whether global warming is something that we have an influence on or not. It is inescapable to say if we are the ones that are going to build cities and we're going to remove trees, let's say, from the environment, then that is going to have an effect on the amount of carbon dioxide that's being used. You don't have to do any special studies. All you have to do is look at this diagram. If then, in addition, we're going to increase the number of carbon dioxide from artificial sources, you're going to see that this system is going to be thrown out of balance. You're going to accumulate this carbon dioxide, and you're not able to pick that up because you don't have as many plants available. And this is the issue. We can see this by a very simple diagram. You don't have to create a lot of fancy studies and, have the government work for 10 years and figure this out. You only need a diagram like this and simply understand how these things work. It's a closed system. We don't get input from elsewhere. We don't do output elsewhere. It's all within us. The question is, what are we going to do about that? And this is the thing I'd like to point out. Let's say that you're driving your car and you hit the curb. You hit the curb pretty hard to the point where your tire is going to wobble. Now most people would say, gosh dang darn it, my tire is wobbly. What am I going to do about it? Well, I better take it to the tire place and have it rebalanced. Does everybody understand what I'm talking about? If you don't rebalance the tire, it's because the tire may wobble and wear unevenly until at some point it might burst at a time when you don't want it to. And it's not really easy to predict that. It's not easy to predict how long you can drive with a wobbly tire at freeway speeds before it does something you don't want it to do. So the reason why you go and have that tire rebalanced is because you don't want to waste a tire. It's because you want to ensure your safety as you drive, and because you want to get back to sort of a predictable outcome. The question is whether we should treat this situation the same way. And I'm not going to tell you one way or another. This is just the question I'm going to leave out there. There are many things we see and we understand about fixing things, and maybe this should be one of them. And you just need to make sure you understand this diagram. In fact, I think this is a diagram that many politicians should look at and understand, and hopefully they'll draw their own correct conclusions from it. And this is just the preface, the preliminaries to cellular respiration. All you have to do is look at a diagram like that. Now back to cellular respiration. Cellular respiration is going to be our way to tap into the bonds of organic molecules. That's what we're going to turn into cellular energy. And so what we're going to do is we're going to find out how we can get the food, the energy in the bonds of the food specifically, to turn into the covalent bonds of the ATP molecule. So ultimately, if you're looking at this in very basic terms, you're going to start with food and you're going to get ATP. That's ultimately what we're looking for, food to ATP. If we want to do this efficiently, we're going to need oxygen. We can do this more efficiently as an automobile, for example, and I'll show you how that works in a minute, and we need to have oxygen in order for us to accomplish this. Since we need oxygen, this process has a specific name. It's called an aerobic process. Aerobic, this is Greek. This has to do in the presence of air, so this is different than AIR. This is aero. And it's just like aerobics, right? When you do your exercise. So it is an aerobic process. And since it's an aerobic process, what we have to figure out is how it works with the breathing, because that's ultimately where our oxygen comes from. Well, you're generally familiar with this, I think, that you breathe in and the oxygen in your lungs is going to be transferred to the bloodstream, and then in the bloodstream it's going to be delivered to a variety of cells, such as your muscle cells, and in those muscle cells, cellular respiration takes place, and then the carbon dioxide that's produced in cellular respiration is going to be released back into the bloodstream through the lungs, and you breathe it out. So if you take a deep breath, in goes air, out goes air, In goes air with a certain amount of oxygen, out goes air with less oxygen, but with more carbon dioxide. And so let's take a look at this business of air. If you look at air and what it's made up of, you'll find that it's made up of 79% nitrogen, which doesn't do anything for us. It's inert to our system. It also includes 21% oxygen. 21% oxygen, and then maybe something like 0.2 or so percent carbon dioxide. So it includes different kinds of things. When we breathe in 21% oxygen. So that's what goes in here. 21%. When we breathe out, we're actually breathing out carbon dioxide, but we're also breathing out some leftover oxygen, in fact about 17%. And so based on that, you can see that what circulates in here is actually 4% oxygen. That's what we really need. We don't need all 21%, we just need some of it. And this oxygen is going to be what will basically be exchanged into carbon dioxide. That's what we're going to use. So when you breathe out, you're breathing out air with 17% oxygen remaining, and that's your use, 4%. And so you can't really rebreathe the same air all the time. In fact, if you give somebody mouth-to-mouth resuscitation, then they only get 17% oxygen from you. When they breathe out, there's only 13% left, and you're breathing into them a higher amount of carbon dioxide. And if you ever do this, if you ever do it when you take a first aid class or something like that, you'll find that when you get up after somebody's breathed into you for a minute or so, you're dizzy. You're dizzy because you're getting all that carbon dioxide in from them. It's kind of like dizzy as the carbon dioxide increases in this room, you actually end up starting to feel a little sleepy sometimes, right? And it's because the level of carbon dioxide increases, and even with air conditioning, it warms up and it just makes you mellow and sleepy. And that's all part of how our respiratory system works. Now, when you look at the chemistry of cellular respiration, you'll realize that it's a pretty straightforward reaction that happens. Cellular respiration is based on glucose. Glucose is a monosaccharide. We encountered it a while ago. And glucose is the fuel. It's our molecular fuel. Anything that we take in, we ultimately try to break down into glucose first. And then glucose is what we'd like to feed into cellular respiration. In the presence of oxygen, we can break down this glucose into carbon dioxide and water, and that's what makes energy available. And so your equation is going to look something like this. This equation is one that you have to remember. It is a balanced equation, so if you look at how many carbons there are, there's 6 carbons here, right? C6. Over on the other side, there are 6 carbons too. 12 hydrogens over there, there's 12 hydrogens. 6 plus 12 oxygens, that's the number you have over here. And so it's a balanced equation. Now there are several arrows here, and these arrows each indicate that something is happening. This is not just one straight arrow. So there are several reactions needed to do this. So there are several parts to cellular respiration before we can actually do this. But the critical parts of this really are these little energy molecules. That's what we're trying to get out. And we try to do it efficiently so that we can supply this large body with all the energy it needs. So that's the first part, the basic introduction to cellular respiration.